Hi, everybody. I am so excited to talk to Nick. For those of you that don't know who Nick is, I have known you, Nick, for how many years now? I feel like we're coming up on 10 years, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
Yeah, and so Nick is really one of those people that I would call remote pioneers. He's the person that came to running remote back in 2019, which was before the pandemic. He has built multiple fantastic companies, both in the BPO space and the general agency space. And the reason why Nick is coming on today is he is launching his brand new book, dependent upon when this actually comes out. And we're going to try to get this out as quickly as possible, Nick. Coming up for air, or is it come up? It's come up for air. Sorry. I know that I had a very early copy, by the way,
Yeah.
Of the manuscript. And I got to tell you, I mean, I have been grinding through this thing for the past 2 or 3 hours. It is absolutely amazing. Really a fantastic book if you're thinking about a process-minded, operational perspective towards running a business. I always talk about how you should either own a business or run a business. You shouldn't do both. And I think this is very much in the first category and not the former. And he's got some amazing people that are saying fantastic things about the book. Marissa Andrada, Tony Robbins, Chip Conley, Nir Eyal. I mean, this is an absolute killer group of people. And I thought before we would get into the actual details of the book, for those of you that don't know, I also wrote a book about 4.5 months ago, 5 months ago, it came out. And we actually have the same publisher, and we even have the same, rep, which is Tim. And I thought we would talk about like the logistics of this book launch, because you're exactly 1 week out from launch date, right? How are things going?
Yeah, how random is it that we've been in each other's worlds for all this time, and then we have the same editor at HarperCollins?
It's pretty nuts.
Yeah.
I remember we talked maybe about 3 or 4 months ago, and you were like, yeah, I'm prepping for launch. Oh, okay. It was HarperCollins. Oh, well, is it Tim? And then it's like, wow, it was mind blowing. And I know that I was back at that book launch time where I was trying to get, my head was going a mile a minute, getting all of those book purchases done, the bulk purchases done versus the individual units, trying to be able to get up to that magic number. And it was a massive slog. And also, too, a lot of the promises that I kept for people in exchange for buying books, I'm still actually paying off all of those debts from a time perspective. And I probably won't be finished for another 2 months. So where are you at right now?
So we launched on February 7th, so a bit more than a week out now. So far, it's been going great. We've been holding good numbers. Tim is super happy with us. And what's been nice is all the people in my network that, that I've helped in some way, or, never. I don't like to have transactional relationships with people. So it's not like, hey, remember 3 years ago when I did this? Can you do this? People like just came out saying, how can I help? And like I've had some really amazing endorsements that I'm very grateful for. Tony Robbins last week tweeted about the book, and I've already got a decent number of reviews, and from like Cameron Herald and Chip Conley and other people. And again, like I didn't even have to ask. Like people are just really trying to be supportive and help. So I'm really blown away by that. And honestly, regardless of bestseller and all those things, which I think I find out today about Wall Street Journal.
Oof. Yeah.
So if you see me distracted, like hitting refresh on that's why.
Yeah.
I'm already getting it. The book is so new that not that many people have finished it, but there have already been a number of people that have finished, and I've been just getting wonderful messages from people that they've gone and created a book club, or
Right.
they'll send a picture of all the highlights and notes. And so that to me is, regardless of kind of rankings and stuff, it's nice to know that you've put something out there that's helped change someone's life and enhance their productivity in some way. And it's just nice to get these random messages from people I've never met before, saying the impact.
One of the things that I that opened my eyes the most with regards to this entire journey of writing a book was identifying those bestseller lists and trying to get to that target. And I remember, as an example, one of the things that was told to me was, well, hey, if you want to hit the Wall Street Journal bestsellers list, which is what we did, we actually had our first week, we didn't hit that list. Our second week, we did hit the list, which I can actually get into in a deeper way if we want to. But the piece that is so confusing to me is the reason why we didn't make it on the list the first week is I did a lot of podcasts at the very beginning, and a lot of friends helped me out by anonymously buying 50, 100, 200 books, which was exactly how you don't get on to all of those bestsellers lists, because those types of bulk buys don't actually count as 200 books. They count as like 1 or 2 or 3 books on the book scan system. So this was one of those things that was incredibly frustrating for me. Have you had any of those people coming out, it just kind of out of the woodwork, or did you have your processes? I mean, you probably did have your processes locked much better than I did in terms of that
good
launch.
Processes with that. And I had the benefit of having some people that have already had experience that I'm close with. I appreciated our consultations before. One of my best friends is John Levy. He wrote a New York Times bestselling book. You're invited. Keith Ferrazzi wrote my foreword, and multiple New York Times. So I'm fortunate to have a lot of people with a lot of experience in this space. So we were pretty prepared for how the game is played and how to do a launch. My strategy, though, which we'll see, we can come back in a year or two and see how it pans out. But I'm trying to write a book. Sure, I want to hit some bestsellers, but I want a book that in 10 years people are still talking about, and I wasn't just trying to have a pop for 1 week and then it just drops back down to, whatever number on Amazon. So I invested disproportionate amount of time on the editing versus the marketing. I actually started the marketing side of the whole thing very late. I mean, this book launched February 7th, and I didn't finish editing until like November. Like they were like giving me a lot of stress. Like, hey, we need to put this needs to go to the printer. I didn't do the Audible until December, and so I only did about like a 2.5 month kind of campaign. And so with such a short run, I had to be really strategic. So I had to really say no to a lot of things and just do the podcasts that were the most relevant, or the activities that were the most relevant. But ultimately, my strategy with this is write the best book possible, and long term, have people, via word of mouth, just tell people, hey, you got to read this book. This is like the employee manual you never got. This is as foundational as 4-hour work week or getting things done was to productivity. This is just productivity 2.0 for teams in the modern workplace. And so that's my hope. I just wanted to write the best book possible. So I put all my effort into editing, and we'll see. Now I'm full-time marketing.
That a really interesting point connected to that is Cal Newport, who wrote Deep Work, which I know that you're aware of and is really a core seminal piece of documentation inside of just the remote work world and the general productivity space. He was not Wall Street Journal or New York Times bestseller for 3 months, and it grew on its own and really turned into what it is now. So you're absolutely right that these 1 to 2 week splash in the pans, yes, I mean, absolutely do that launch, but the real goal is perennial sellers. So it's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think that initial jolt, I kind of think of it like launching a rocket ship into space. Like, you have to put a lot of energy to get into space, but like at some point, like, you're really just hoping it gets into orbit and can like survive on its own.
Yeah, exactly. Another question I had for you is Tony Robbins putting out that tweet. Could you quantify that? Could you see any results from that? Because I mean, not just in the remote workspace, but in the general guru space, there's no bigger name than Tony Robbins. How did that go in terms of the overall impact and trajectory with regards to the book?
I'm not sure yet. I haven't gotten the numbers from Tim. That was just a couple days ago.
Okay.
not to name drop, but I have been fortunate to, have people like him that can, he gave the front cover endorsement and, shot him a text a couple days ago and, he's tweeting about it. Or I have a friend, I've had a range of people. Obviously, he's probably the most relevant for this space because, yeah, he is, a huge, like a living legend in that. But I've had a range. Like I have my friend Andrew Schultz, who's a comedian. If you go and look on my Instagram right now at Nicholas Sonnenberg, he gave a funny rant on his podcast. He's getting millions and millions of views on that. I had a Victoria's Secret model a couple days ago post about it. So it's like it's getting a range with millions of followers. So I'll get the final book numbers, but I don't know. I think ultimately those things maybe do some short-term pops, but I think the only thing that's really going to make a difference is word of mouth and people reading it and suggesting it.
Yeah, going 4 months into the future, where I'm currently at right now, one of the most interesting phenomenons that I found is almost no one is buying the hardcover book at this point. 90% of our sales are all through Audible. And
what's funny is I'm actually already more Audible than hardcover.
There you go. And it's really such a huge shift, and it's frustrating because from the book scan system, Audibles don't count. So you're always encouraging people to be able to buy the hardcover of the book. But at the same time, if you want people to truly consume the content, Audible is the best machine to be able to do it.
Did you record your own Audible?
No, I didn't. And if Tim is listening to this, Tim specifically told me, you don't have the time to do it, and you're not good enough to do it in comparison to the other people that I have. So he wanted me to try out in comparison to the other two.
You lost your own competition to your Audible there.
Exactly.
He had me compete too, but I really tried hard to.
You're probably more convincing, to be honest with you, than me. And
this is what I said to him. Look, it's exhausting. Doing the Audible was 4 days in a studio. It's brutal. I hired a voice coach though, and I can give you, if you ever are going to do something like that, that was helpful to do some exercises and highlight it to have inflection and stuff. But at least with my book, one thing that I learned is you don't actually have to read the book word for word when you're doing the Audible. You can improvise a bit. Right. And so with my book, since there's a lot of concepts and, we're talking about efficiency and operational efficiency, knowing when to enunciate something, or if you wanted to improvise something to explain something a bit further, because listening to something versus reading something, especially with operational efficiency, there's some nuance. So I said to Tim, I just don't see how a voiceover person is going to be successful doing this, because they're going to miss a lot of these nuances, that could be really important. But it's a ton of work, that Audible.
Yeah. I think I'm happy I didn't do it, but if I ever do a relaunch in the future, maybe I'll do
probably
that.
5% of my book is different on Audible.
Oh, well then I think probably people, now that we're at kind of post-launch, go check out the Audible. We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah. Look, at this point, I just want as many people to listen to it, read it, get benefit. At the same point, though, also I think a rating on Audible counts as a rating on hardcover, right? It's just like all one rating system.
I think so. I think that's the way it works.
So it's still helpful in the sense, like ratings, even though it doesn't count towards, a bestseller list if they buy that, getting ratings is, I think, it's extremely important. It's something that people don't realize how helpful it is to, if someone read your book and they enjoyed it, how helpful it is and a nice gesture to go to Amazon and give you a rating and write a little bit of review. It takes 30 seconds, but it really makes a huge difference to the algorithm on Amazon.
Absolutely. In the context of efficiency, let's talk about why you actually wrote the book.
Yep.
Why did you write this book? As someone who just did it, it was very time consuming. I think from a long-term ROI perspective, we'll see, but it took a lot of my personal time, and a lot of that time I could have applied to other things, building other businesses, building out different departments, those types of things. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I guess twofold. One is I know firsthand what it's like to drown in work. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to run a high-functioning, high-performing team, because my story is we grew very quickly. We grew to 7 figures the first year, fully remote, 150 people on the team, which is all, impressive to people. What people don't realize is under the hood, we were a complete mess. And we had, almost $1 million of debt, losing $500,000 a year. And our org chart was just 2 people. I was behind the scenes and I had a business partner that was people facing. And then one day we're getting coffee and he taps me on the shoulder and he tells me he's out. Not in 2 weeks, not in 2 days. He's out in like 2 minutes. And, I'm thinking to myself during this time, this can't be happening. We're going to go bankrupt. And we really almost did, frankly. In the coming 3 months, we lost about 40% of revenue. And before I know it, I'm cashing out my 401k. My dad's taking a second mortgage on his house to loan money for payroll. You think, moving into your parents' basement is bad. Try driving them to the bank to sign equity line agreement. So I had to make a choice. Do I bankrupt the company or do I try to re-navigate the ship? And I had some pretty clear ideas of what needed to change to re-navigate the ship. And so I started realizing we needed to clean up how you're communicating. There's all these messages all over the place. I realized I couldn't answer basic questions like, did this person complete that task that I wanted them to complete? Or what was the status of this project? Like things that should be 2 clicks away were like 20 clicks away. And I knew that at scale, this was wasting a lot of time that could be refocused into things that were going to drive bottom line and top line in the business. And then lastly, I knew we had all this intellectual property, our SOPs, our processes. And frankly, I was pretty good about keeping that documented or else we probably would have gone bankrupt. And so things started quickly turning around and simultaneously people started reaching out, asking me to consult them on their operations. And so some of the people we talked about earlier, and it could range from a 7-figure entrepreneur up to multi-billion-dollar companies, all different industries. And it turned out everyone I worked with had very similar needs and issues. It didn't matter if you were the world's leading coach or you were a poop spray or you were a cryptocurrency. You needed to communicate with people internally and externally. You needed to plan. You had tasks and projects, and you had these resources. And so I had this light bulb moment, like, hey, maybe the real opportunity here is to repurpose leverage, which back then we were a freelancer marketplace doing tasks and projects for people. So we were always in the space of helping people save time. But I saw all the impact that we had, helping them, training them on best practices that we were kind of creating internally. Like leverage was always kind of this laboratory experimenting like with all these different tools and what are the best practices of using them. And I started realizing like, hey, actually getting this out to the world and teaching them and training them, not just how to use Slack or Asana or these tools, but when, like in what scenario, in what kind of day-to-day business scenario, if you need to ask someone to write a blog, should that be in a text? Should that be in an email? Should that be in a Slack? Should that be in Asana? And when you ask people, you get, if you ask 10 people at a different company, you get 10 different answers. And the fact that you get 10 different answers and there's no alignment means that there's this scavenger hunt. And if people aren't aligned into when to use each of these tools and they don't know when and how to use it, there's a gross amount of inefficiency. We started seeing very quickly we could save people a business day a week. And so we repositioned Leverage to be an operational efficiency training and consulting company. And ultimately, I decided to write the book because I want to get the message out to the world. I don't want people to drown in work like I did. And I wanted to write a book that will be a piece of legacy for me. You know, I want in 30 years people to look back and say, like, this was, you know, a foundational book to a new way of work. And I want to be known for helping to have given millions of hours back to people across the world. And, you know, hopefully this is helpful and you know, hopefully also this drives some awareness to leverage my business and people that want to go deeper and they want to get some more hands-on training. now they'll be aware of the benefit and, work with us in a deeper capacity as well.
I have a follow-on kind of connected to that. With regards to operational efficiency, it's always something that people want, but and it has such a huge impact on the overall business, but very few people say that they need it. It's kind of like a nice to have versus a need to have. At least when I look at companies and they say, I'll say, well, you haven't really hired like a VP of ops or a COO. Well, yeah, well, it's not really that important, right? And then I say, okay, but we're having a conversation about process documentation. Like, what do you mean? Well, it's not really important to be able to hire someone like that. We just need to kind of do it. It's like operations and processes are our hobby. They're not actually like our job and department.
What stage business are you talking to that say things like this? Or
So
is it all stages?
I would say once they get past the Dunbar number, that's where they have a holy crap, which is about 100 to 150 people. Dunbar, the concept is that once you get over 150 people, people cease to become a person and they become numbers just fundamentally, and it's a forcing function for process documentation. So I seem to see a huge wave of the companies that succeed have process documentation, and the ones that don't haven't actually that get to the Dunbar number, they kind of just they pump the brakes at that particular point and their revenue falters. So it's really frustrating for me, but then the actual process of starting that needs to happen honestly at employee 5.
So it's people like smaller teams or smaller companies are the ones saying it's a hobby, but then you're saying once they break some kind of larger number, that's when they start getting a bit more serious, you're saying?
Yeah, so no one can have a business that doesn't have process documentation that's smaller than 150 people. So like once you hit that 150 person mark, you must have process documentation in some form in order to continue to scale that business. At least that's my own personal theory on process documentation, particularly inside of remote teams. But it's just it's one of those things that when I look at the head count's 20, the head count's 5, the head count's 50, it's still something that is not a need. It's a want. It's a nice to have.
Well, look, I think that there's definitely a correlation between the value it provides and the ratio of short-term to long-term investment that you give to a business. For example, when you're smaller, if you're a team of 5 and you can barely make payroll, right? You have to be shifting all your chips to 100% short-term, 0% long-term, basically, because if you can't make payroll, you don't have a business. Right? As you grow and you build a bit of a cushion and you build a bit of revenue and profitability, money can people are always like, does money buy you happiness? Well, to a certain degree, yeah, it does. And it does buy you freedom, and it buys you choice and options. So the more money you have, the more breathing room you have to invest in long term. Mm-hmm. So as you get bigger and you grow, you'll have more freedom to choose. Instead of 100 chips on short term and 0 on long term, maybe you can take the luxury of now investing 90-10 or 80-20. And so I think as you grow and you have that, you have a few bullets to fire, you can do that. It's the only thing I think that is important, because everyone's at different stages, different needs. And again, if I've been there before where it's like, you don't know how you're gonna make payroll next week. Like when my business partner left, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't make sense for me to be documenting like a process at that point. Like I just got to pick up the phone and sell, because if I don't, we won't have a business. But I was aware that every second I was spending doing that was strategic, and I was consciously prioritizing something short term versus things that were long term, because that was what was most strategic for the business. And so I just think that people need to be aware what ratio of short term to long term they're spending, and just make sure, like, just do a spot check. Like, is this strategic? If you've got cushion, you're profitable, and all that, what's optimal over a 3-year period? Like, what decision are you making today that will help drive maximal growth over not a month or a few months, but a 3 to 5 year period, right? And I think when you start looking at things from that lens, it starts making it a little bit more clear. Oh, okay, actually, maybe I should fix this thing because, yeah, it's going to take maybe a few months till it kicks in and we start seeing the time savings. But over a 3-year period, we're going to save 1,000 hours if we do that. And so over a 3-year period, with those 1,000 hours, maybe we could generate an extra $5 million or whatever the number is. And so I think it's important to really be making decisions over a longer time horizon. And an example I use all the time, companies right now, it's like you have a sink that is broken, you have a pipe broken and water is overflowing. Say it takes you an hour to patch the pipe or 5 minutes to mop the floor, right? Most people are deciding to mop the floor and move on to the next thing. But if every week you have to do that 5-minute mop, after 12 weeks, you would have broken even on the investment of time to have patched the pipe. Right? Now, it could be that you literally need to make payroll tomorrow, so you're aware of it, but it's still better for you to spend the 5 minutes because you need that 55 minutes or you're not going to make payroll. But just be aware that, investing the time into some long-term foundational elements, whether it's documenting process, whether it's properly rolling out a tool like Asana so you're not wasting time trying to manage tasks and projects inside of communications tools. Like, all of these things are investments of time into a foundation that, just like patching the pipe, at a certain point, maybe it's at the 12-week mark, you've broken even, and now every day or every week that you're getting benefit from that investment from 12 weeks ago, you get that now for the rest of your life.
Right.
And so that's the thinking.
Yeah. So I'd love to unpack that a little bit. You talk about in the book the CPR framework, which I believe is communication, planning, and resources, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Unpack that a little bit in terms of how you would address that. Because I actually think a really good way to think about it, and you brought up some fantastic points there, was how much time do I think on strategic planning? Like, how much time should I invest in making a better mousetrap versus like hunting some mice today, right? I got a spear today, but maybe I could spend the end of my afternoon working on a better spear or some other type of mousetrap to be able to go after something. Like, do you have a framework for how you would look at different stages of your business and how much time you should apply to strategic planning and the CPR framework?
So the CPR framework, as you mentioned, is communicate, plan, and resource. We found it doesn't matter what type of business you are. Those are the 3 drawers of information every business needs to think about. And like in your personal life, if you do your laundry, you take your laundry out, you're not just throwing it into one drawer, even though that's the fastest way to be done with your laundry. You spend the time to separate socks in one drawer, underwear in another drawer, and you sacrifice that and time investment of not finishing laundry the quickest way possible, but slowing down a bit and separating things, because tomorrow when you need to put an outfit together, you've made it 10 times faster to retrieve what you're looking for your outfit. So the underlying principle with all of this stuff and what CPR ultimately is all about is changing the mindset of a company from being one of transferring information as fast as possible, this game of hot potato, here's a text, here's an email, just take it. I'm at full capacity. I can't handle anymore. I tap out. To, hey, we all are agreeing that we're going to pause, slow down, take an extra few seconds and put it in the right drawer, because in a month from now, if I need to find it, or if in a week from now my colleague needs to find it, we've made that 10 times easier and you've avoided that scavenger hunt. That's the silent killer inside of teams, is how do you avoid that scavenger hunt? The mental trigger for me is anytime I do something that doesn't give me joy or tap into my unique ability, and I've done it more than once, that's my mental trigger. Let's start thinking about, how do I never have to do this again?
Right.
And then you have to prioritize what's the biggest bang for your buck. Documenting processes, that could take years. You probably have hundreds or thousands of processes, but maybe you don't need to do all at once. Maybe there's 3 that are the most critical to your business to start with, and that's, maybe that's more achievable. You could do an 80-20 on that, and you don't have to document every single detail of it, but maybe you take the top one process and you document 80% of it quite quickly, and maybe you record a Loom video of you performing and you pass it off to a VA to then go and finish updating it. So there's different, it's a spectrum of, it's all a spectrum. You can invest 1,000,000 hours into that, or you can invest 10. And sometimes you have to just make a judgment call. What's the 80-20 here? What's something that will save me the most amount of time with the least amount of effort to roll out? And also the biggest thing is, don't just think about yourself. Think about this. If you're a team lead or a business owner, think about this at scale across your team. It's one thing to do something that saves you an hour, but if you're a team of 20 and it saves an hour for everyone, that's 20 man hours that you just saved. So think about things at scale in aggregate across your team and make decisions at a team level versus an individual level. It's like in math. I come from a math background. The whole transferring information fast is a local optimization. And a big problem in business and in teams is you're locally optimizing for whatever's fastest for you. How do I save a few seconds? But when you change the mindset and you change it to being a team approach, and that's shifting it from an individual to a team. It's a local optimization to a global optimization. How in aggregate, what should we do that's going to impact the team and save the team the most amount of hours? And that's what my book is all about.
I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago, a tweet went out that went pretty viral. It was applying the hourly rate of all employees inside of Google Calendar meetings.
Yeah.
Did you see that?
I tried looking for, was that just a Photoshop, or is there actually a Chrome plugin that does that?
So it was just photoshopped. Is
That's what I
basically just
thought,
a
'cause
meme.
I looked.
Yeah, but there's a company that's doing it now called Fellow. And
I use Fellow.
Yeah,
but
they're going to launch it
Fellow
literally
doesn't
in
do
3
it
weeks. They're launching it in 3 weeks, which I think is really, really cool. And so it's just kind of like that mindset of, oh, let me just set up a meeting with 17 people that are all, $185 an hour as an example. What's the actual impact of that? Not many people really think about it. And it's so important to be mindful of where you're applying your time and not just think about your own personal efficiency, but think about the efficiency from an organizational perspective. I mean, that's very, very rarely do people think organizationally, unfortunately. They think very self-referentially, and they don't think about, well, how could I make this team more efficient? They think, unfortunately, how can I make myself more efficient?
Something I talk about in the book too, it's not just about saving time, it's about optimizing time. One of the biggest inefficiencies in companies is how meetings are run. So that's why I'm a fan of Fellow. Like, even if you just use like the agenda, most companies don't use agendas. And they're not thinking about the cost of a meeting, where the cost is, you take everyone's hourly rate times the length of time in that meeting, you add it up. Meetings last year alone, it was estimated that in the U.S. it was $35 billion of waste in unproductive meetings last year. And the funny thing is that a lot of those meetings were about how to be more productive. And meetings have too many people. If you think about all the factors that influence the cost, it's the length of time, it's the number of people, it's the frequency of the meeting, and it's the hourly rate of those people in the meeting. And so something I talk about in the book is my framework isn't just about strategies to save time, but also you need to be thinking about how to optimize time, because time isn't linear. And an hour, let's just say our hourly rates are $1,000 an hour. It's not that every time slot on the calendar is worth $1,000 to us. For me, 7 o'clock on a Friday after 100 Zoom calls and podcasts every day, like, I'm a bit exhausted by that time. If I'm exhausted and I'm in the back of an Uber and I don't have my laptop, that isn't $1,000 an hour time slot for me. Right? Versus 9 a.m. on a Monday when I've just had a relaxing weekend and I woke up and I worked out and I had my coffee and my brain's at full horsepower, that might be worth $5,000 an hour to me, right? And so if you think about your calendar, it's not that every time slot is the same color. It's more like a heat map, where like maybe if you're a morning person, those are green and those are worth like 10 times what, at the end of a day after a lot of Zoom calls is worth. This is also the same logic why you don't want to have a therapy call on a Friday at 7:00. You want your therapist to be fresh. You don't want.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So, no, little productivity hack: do your doctor's appointments early in the morning.
I think there was a study as well on judges in Israel, and they identified that if they gave judges almonds throughout the day, they actually would let off a lot more people in their court, simply because they weren't hungry. So they were in a better mood, and they were able to actually pay attention to people and listen to people more effectively.
So not to go on a tangent, because the book is all about operational efficiency, but whether you can save time or do things in your personal life or business, it's all helpful.
Right.
Also, another benefit of taking the early time slots with doctor's appointments, not only are you getting them with their fresh brain in general, because sometimes some people, they're more night people, or their brain hits full horsepower at different times. But in general, I think 9 a.m., 10 a.m., that's where people are, their brain is sharpest. But also, have you ever gone to a doctor's office and then you're waiting for 45 minutes because they've triple booked? I hate wasting time in business, personal life. So if you take the first time slot, you avoid that whole triple booking potential too.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to try that next week. I got to talk to my doctor about a lot of stuff.
And all of my content, the book, it's all built off of pain. So what ends up happening is I experience something and I get really, really frustrated. And then the engineer in me, because my background's in financial engineering, me is like, I need to build something to solve this. I need to come up with a framework, a system, a new concept, because I kind of look at myself, I'll be the guinea pig, I'll feel the pain, but then I'll develop a strategy so that I never have to do this again, and I can, bring this to my clients.
Yeah.
And so everything that I talk about, it's not theoretical. It's we firsthand played with something, experimented with it, felt the impact. We create some content and we stress test it. Then we bring it to clients, stress test it, refine it, and then ultimately, 4 years later, I started the book 4 years ago. Then ultimately have a book. It's kind of like my friend Andrew, the stand-up comedian. He goes to stand-up. He drops into the Comedy Cellar in lots of places. He tests material constantly.
Right.
And after about 9 months, and he's refined it, then he's got enough material for a 50-minute special. It's kind of the same thing with what we're talking about. We tinker with things for months and months, and we'll have arguments over real nuances, like, hey, should we use fellow like this or Asana like this? And we'll experiment and get feedback loops, and then eventually, okay, this is best practice. And then we'll create online courses, we'll create PDFs and decks, and then bring it to the world.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. It has definitely been, at least in my experience, refining a whole bunch of information into a book is a very difficult process. One of the questions that I have for you, and again, I have probably read about 50% of the book, to be completely honest with you, and it was an earlier version. I'm looking at a Word doc versus having the real. I got to get the hardcover. I wish I could have had it.
Look how nice the hardcover is. It has this feel to it.
It almost looks like it's torn, by the way, on the top.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. How did it feel, by the way, getting the first book and putting it in your hands?
Yeah, it was really cool, honestly, because also, as you know, even every detail takes a long time. So even just the cover, should there be a puddle of water under the chair? Do you know how much time we spent on little details like this? Or is the shoreline, is the shading everything, it was hours and hours to get that cover. So when I finally got it, I'm like, that's a cool cover. That's a cover that, I'll remember, and I would stick out at a bookstore. And, I think, fortunately, unfortunately, I think the cover really, you have a great cover for yours too. I don't know how much time you spent on that, but I loved your cover. I think covers are really important because you could have great content, but if it's not visually appealing, you might miss people to click the button to get it.
17 iterations.
Yeah.
on this cover. 17. And I ran some paid advertising to be able to actually identify what had the highest click-through rate.
Yep.
Wasn't incredibly well. So one of the biggest things that I did is I just used my own personal community, and we would just refine. I'd have 3 versions. I'd refine that, and then I'd have 3 more versions, and we just kept kind of working it to the point in which basically those 3 groups, or the group that I was communicating to, thought all 3 copies were equally good. And then I was like, okay, I think I've got something there. But let's get back to the book for a second. A question that I wanted to ask is, and this is one that has been knocking me constantly for my book, I had a chapter that we pulled, which was I worked with 20 companies on how to deploy asynchronous management inside of their companies. And I know that you have a chapter on asynchronous, or at least a subsection on asynchronous management inside of the book. The reason why I pulled it is we worked with 20 companies, and my definition of asynchronous was less than 10% of their work week was spent on internal video communication. And so that...
Let me digest that. Less than 10% of their week was spent on
internal video communication, internal synchronous communication, effectively.
So like Zooms or
like Riverside or Google Meet or whatever we're talking, whatever we're on right now.
So if they spent less, so on a 40-hour work week, if they spent less than 4 hours on Zoom or Google Meet,
they were async.
They were you would classify them as an asynchronous.
Correct. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
and why 10%?
That was generally me talking to all of these asynchronous pioneers and really asking them. A lot of them, GitLab as an example, has 0 time for sync work. They actually try to get it down to 0. But I knew that wouldn't be applicable towards all companies. And the newest data that just came out of companies that transitioned towards remote during the pandemic saw that 67% of their time was spent on synchronous work, which is pretty crazy. We float at about 22%. And so I was trying to basically get these companies to, number 1, measure the amount of synchronous time that they spend inside of their companies, and number 2, to be able to reduce that amount to 10%. So
if you worked a 40-hour work week,
yep,
and you did 0 calls with your team and all calls over Zoom but sales calls, would you count that as a 0%?
No.
And you'd call
that
them
would
async?
be for sales. That would not be an internal conversation.
Right.
That would
so
be
you
an
wouldn't
external
consider
conversation.
It. Right. So you would, if your entire team were sales and no one spoke to each other except to clients, it would be 0
They'd
of
be
the
async.
10%.
Yeah.
So you'd be a fully async. Gotcha.
Right.
So you look at your calendar and you see what percentage of your calendar are live Zoom calls with your team.
Exactly. Yeah. And so
Gotcha.
out of the 20 companies that we ran this program with, 10 of them increased the amount of synchronous time over a 3-month period. 7 of them reduced their time by an insignificant to significant amount. And 3 of those 20 companies ended up hitting below 10% of their work week being synchronous. And I pulled the chapter because it was just a really bad example of of trying to implement this process. But I found that there were 3 major barriers actually towards people getting to an asynchronous mindset and asynchronous management, which was the adaptation of that process amongst everyone inside of the organization. There was a lot of pushback of people that said, well, we've managed this way before, we're going to continue to manage that way in the future. The ability for certain individuals to kind of like, particularly executives and director levels, to kind of break the system by saying, hey, I need this right now. There was a form of immediacy that was slowing down the operational structure of the company. And then the third one was everyone had done a pretty good job at process documentation, but the querying of that process documentation was horrible. And we identified in the failed attempts, the ones that went up in terms of synchronous communication, only 2% of their process documents on average, and we were using a company called Trainual to be able to actually query all this data.
Yeah, I
they
know those
found
guys.
that only 2% of their process documents were being queried on a regular basis, more than a week. So there's all this documentation, and no one's actually collecting that information, no one's
Yeah.
actively using that information. In terms of the CPR network or protocol and framework, what are the barriers? Like, how are people not getting this? Because I think that's a really important thing to be able to touch on as well. We're talking about, hey, this is this beautiful, magical, utopian future, but what are the speed bumps that people are going to encounter along the way?
Totally. I mean, I feel like I could jam with you for a whole other episode just on asynchronous versus synchronous. I was just scanning my calendar. We're probably somewhere in the 15% right
There we
now,
go.
15 to 20.
And that is, to be honest with you, best in class. You effectively are as close to an asynchronous organization as you can possibly get, because to me, I set that 10% literally just talking to all of these asynchronous pioneers. But at the end of the day, no one can not communicate synchronously. I think that's just
also
not
depends
possible.
on. I think it also depends on your industry and the type of business you're in. I think that if you're a service-based business, that's going to operate different than if you are a SaaS tool and 80% of your employees are engineers.
Right.
Right? I think that there also needs to take into account a bit one, by industry or by kind of breakdown of role, like, because again, heavily weighted towards engineers they're gonna, be having headphones on coding a lot, and doing things asynchronously just by virtue of their job, more so than someone in marketing that needs to collaborate with the writers, the designers. Do you know what I mean? So I think that depending on the distribution of roles in a business, it might make a difference. And also, I think what's the objective function we're measuring? Like, how do we say is it working or not working? How do we know that 10% is better than 20%, as measured by what? And what we found, at least in the context of async, we were probably 10%, and I probably pushed it up to 15 to 20 because I found that there were issues arising and there were situations where async was worse than sync. So I think I talk about this a bit in the book.
You do.
But there's async is great, and there's so many benefits, right? And like a lot of those benefits are obvious, and you highlight them really well in your book, and I talk about them too. But there's also downsides that you have to be aware of. Like, you don't want to give negative feedback to someone over Slack.
Right.
Like that could hurt culture. And sometimes jumping on a 5-minute Zoom can solve a problem much faster than, typing it out in Slack. And then you only realize that there's 30 back and forth and they're still not understanding. And actually, just a live call with a screen share and hearing inflection in your voice could have solved the problem much faster. And so there are that, it's a weapon that you need to use appropriately, like anything. And it's great. There's so many benefits, but there are certain cases where you shouldn't. Like, we started doing daily stand-ups, especially around book launch. That added to our synchronous time, because now we do 15-minute calls every day, right? So it's an hour and 15 minutes a week towards that synchronous. That helped to avoid a million Slack and Asana messages, though, that probably would have slowed us down much more than the hour and 15 minutes of time investment. So now the CPR framework, in the context of what you're talking about, resources is all about documenting processes and knowledge. And also, back to what I said before, the underlying principle is setting up systems and processes to optimize for retrieval versus transfer. And so it's almost zero value. And again, I've been there. I've wasted money where people say, oh yeah, I spent 20 hours this week documenting processes, and then you can't find it. Or like, I spent 20 hours building this deck somewhere, and then it's buried somewhere in your Google Drive. And it's like, you might as well just light the money on fire, because it's like no one's ever going to see it again, right? So it's all about retrieval. And if people can't easily retrieve something, it's kind of near useless. So it's really important not just to document, but that you have some type of framework where it's easy for people to find what they're looking for.
Right.
right? Where it's easy to retrieve.
You're hitting on the third largest problem, which was the ability for people to not access documentation was the biggest reason why not just the executive team failed, but everyone below that tree failed.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the lack of retrieval that is causing the biggest inefficiency I see in business. And it's not just inefficiency, it's also stress and culture. If you don't trust that someone's going to do something or that something happened, you get anxiety, you start, we've all been there before, all of a sudden, like, I start texting, emailing, slacking. Hey, Kay, just want to follow up. Did you get that done? Or, is this, where's this? And you do that because you don't trust people have good systems to follow through, and you can't click a button and know what the status is. So then that causes a lot of wasted time on people to follow up, but also it causes friction and anxiety. And there's different dimensions of trust. You could trust someone is ethical, but not trust that they have good follow through or will do what they say. And in a large part, that's because of a breakdown of processes and systems. And so equally important to this whole conversation isn't just these strategies to save time within your entire team, but it also is a byproduct, equally important, is that it increases culture.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and just as an aside, a very nerdy aside, Slight.com, which is process documentation management. They effectively want to be the project management system for asynchronous teams. They just put forward a new feature, which I love. They've implemented ChatGPT directly inside of their process documentation. So you can now just say, what's the PTO policy of leverage? And it will tell you in a small snippet. It will tell you, this is the PTO policy, but it's based off of these 8 process documents that you can tunnel into deeper. And I just thought to myself, this is totally going to solve the query problem in a much bigger way, just using technology to be able to make that library of systems that you're talking about so much easier to be able to get access to.
Yeah, I think that's definitely I think there was also, I think Guru has functionality previously before ChatGPT, and I think Ask Nicely was also in that space a while ago. Mm-hmm. I definitely think it's going to help, but what I fear is that people will get lazy and like just start throwing a bunch of crap into like one folder and not spend the time to get it a bit organized because they just think that like some AI is going to be like AI is going to be great and probably help, but I don't think that it means you also shouldn't well architect kind of your operations. Right. Like imagine if you have both, and like you could find things very quickly, but also it'll probably make the AI much faster too, because then it'll know with higher probability, oh, I'm looking for that document for the podcast SOP. Well, if there's a folder called podcasts and then there's a document in that folder called SOP, like the AI will probably have a better chance of finding it versus just one folder with like a million documents on SOP. So you'll increase kind of the success rate of the AI, I think, still further when you architect the back end properly. Yeah,
I mean, do both for sure. Make it very easy to query, but then also implement these types of query technologies.
And ChatGPT has an open API, so you'll start seeing like Asana and Monday and all these tools start integrate. I think Notion just integrated ChatGPT into Notion.
Mm-hmm. I just used a tool called Clearworld that uses ChatGPT for all Zoom calls. So it indexes all of your Zoom conversations, and then afterwards you can query all of your Zoom calls, but they're just pulling out the dictation. They're not actually recording the call, which I think will be really, I mean, there's a ton of different tools, obviously. I think this is going to be...
What was that one called?
Clearworld. Very, very cool stuff. Just in terms of...
URL.
I think it's clearworlds.com. Clearworld Zoom meetings. If you pop that into Google, you'll probably find it.
Okay, I did Clearworld Zoom.
Or we'll put it in we'll put it in the notes, sure, as well, because I'm sure that a lot of people are looking for
a word.
Yeah, Clearword.
W-O-R-D?
Yes.
Oh, I was typing world. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Cool.
I know I want to remain cognizant of your time, but here's a question that I want to ask from the ultimate productivity guy. What tools? I know that you have an entire chapter about Asana, which is very cool and where I went first, to be completely honest with you, because we use Asana as well internally, and it really is the backbone of all of our different project management systems. Like our
Yeah.
engineers still want to be on Jira, and we understand that, but if someone actually wants to communicate with me from the engineering department, they really have to do it through Asana, which they don't like, but we're forcing them into that
Yep.
process. What are some other
Yep.
tools inside of the tech stack that you would suggest
So,
people check out?
so the most important is that you know the purpose of these tools, when to use them, and how to use them. In my book, we're tool agnostic, except with the caveat of Asana, and we make this clear in the book. But we really wanted to take the approach where, in 10 years from now, all these tools might change, but the theory and that CPR framework is just a theory that will last. And so we mentioned in the book, look, here are a bunch of tools that could solve this problem. This is what we use at Leverage, but here are all some of the competitors right now that you also can, very much try. We use Loom a lot for asynchronous. I talk about in the book how, even if you can save 50, if you could, back to our meetings discussion, if you can cut down an hour meeting to 45 minutes because there's 15 minutes of the meeting that's a report out where people are sharing their screen on data and numbers and reports, and you could tell them to send me a Loom video of 15 minutes going through that. Now I'm going to watch that in the back of an Uber when I'm doing nothing else. That's a massive optimization for time, because that 15 minutes at the 9 a.m. time slot could be worth hundreds of dollars to you, right? Because again, like, time isn't linear. So we use a ton of Loom. We're using Fellow for the agendas, Slack, Gmail, Asana. A lot of people think that we're got a ton of different tools. Like HubSpot is our CRM, and that's kind of it. I use Cloud App for annotated screenshots because Loom is great for video, but the screenshotting, for whatever reason, they're not doing annotated screenshots, which is silly.
Yeah,
so I got to
feel
use
it's a
both
huge
tools.
missed move on them, to be completely honest with you. But
Yeah.
because I do exactly the same thing. I have Vidyard for photos, and I have Loom for videos, which is nuts.
How is Vidyard? Are you liking it?
It's pretty good for photos. You can also use it for video as well. It's a really good free option in comparison to Loom, which is a paid option. So, dependent upon what your budget is.
I've been using a Chrome plugin called Workona for managing my tabs. That's really helpful.
Workona.
So you can organize tabs by topic. So you could have finance, and you click a button, and then Stripe and QuickBooks and whatever you look at for your finances pops up. Or I have a daily tab just for the common stuff. Or for you run a podcast. I'm sure Riverside and other different websites are important for you when you're when you got your podcast hat on.
Right.
And then it also suspends the tabs that you're not using so that it doesn't eat your CPU. So that can be a helpful one.
Okay.
And a lot of people aren't pinning their tabs, but there's my Gmail, my calendar, my Fellow for agenda. These are things that, regardless of kind of whether I'm in finance, daily, marketing, whatever, I always want easy access. So if you right click on a tab and you pin, that's a quick trick that most people
I do
don't
exactly the same thing. Such a huge time saver, just in terms of saying, this is kind of like my operating system for work, which is I got my 3 pins. I actually have my Gmail, my calendar, and then my Google Drive, so that I can actually get access to all of the documents that I need from time to time. And then everything else is I inbox zero and I tab zero. And now that I've been tab zeroing, that's been very helpful for me as well. I've been doing that for about a year.
Yeah. It's all a to-do, whether it's a tab with an article you need to read or a task. I mean, it's got to get to do zero.
Exactly.
Inbox zero in email, in Asana, in your tabs.
Well,
It's in everything. And inbox zero is the number one thing that we're teaching people right now at Leverage. It's funny because email has been around for so long, but every person on the face of the planet uses either Gmail or Outlook, and they use it incorrectly. And we see on average 3 to 5 hours a week of wasted time on email alone. And so learning inbox zero is probably the number one productivity trick for me.
maybe I can have you back on and we can talk more about that kind of stuff, because you're absolutely right. I do inbox zero every day, and I've been doing it for about 4 years. A complete game. I mean, I can't say how effective that is in terms of just you as an individual being more productive, and then also teaching that to everyone inside of your organization. I don't want to take any more of your time. I know that you've got a call coming up pretty soon. It's been great chatting with you. As I said before,
bud.
I'd love to be able to have you come back at another time and we can kind of nerd out
Whenever
on
you want.
tools. I literally, we could just have a podcast about like productivity and efficiency tools, and just name them off, because I'm the guy that tries all these demos morning, noon, and night.
100%.
But
Well, we should have you on my pod. I'm launching a podcast. You know who Jay Abraham is?
yes, I do.
So me and Jay, for those listening that don't know Jay, he's an icon in the marketing and business strategy space.
Right.
The guy charges $120,000 a day to consult with him. It's like insane. And he's a dear friend, and we're launching a podcast together where we do live consultations, and we'll do a 90-minute free consultation with a business. Typically it's like in the 8 to 9 figure range, and we'll just unstuck them on any problem that they have, efficiency, marketing strategy, etc. You can anonymize your name and your business, but it's really just interesting content. So,
And what's the name of the podcast?
it's not out yet. We're calling it the Optimized Podcast.
Okay.
We'll talk about this offline,
Very
but
cool.
if you want. And also for those listening that are interested in my book and CPR, my URL is comeupforair.com, and we've got a ton of additional resources. So as you know from writing a book, you don't want it to be too long. I already pushed the limit at 320 pages, and I'm an efficiency nut. So if I weren't, it would have been like 1,400 pages. And so at some point, Tim was like, this can't be any longer. So throughout the book, we're like, if you want to go deeper and see the checklist, the playbook, the calculator, go to comeupforair.com. So that's a website with a whole bunch of additional bonus material to the book.
Awesome. And I'm assuming go there first in terms of if you're interested in buying the book, because you probably get the best
you
deal
could
there.
find links. You can find links to buy the book there. We have some bulk discounts for teams and some packages, but also we have all the bonus material.
Yeah, great. And for anyone as well, give the guy a 5-star rating. It really does help with the algorithm. And I'm going to go to your website right now, or to Amazon right now, and put in that 5-star rating. For anyone that wants to read more about Nick, go to Get Leverage. Is it .co or .com? .com? .com.
GetLeverage.com, comeupforair.com.
Bingo. Go check out those spots. Nick, really appreciate having you on, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple months for another one.
Thanks, bud.
Thanks.